Okay, so we are currently recording, and the resolution isn't as good as I would normally have for, for your videos. That's because I'm doing this through Zoom right now, so it's kind of limited. But the concept today, and you can see I just made a mess earlier, so that's what happens when you spill the ink. So great question came up on the call of, yes, you do want to make sure that you have a clean space to work with. One thing you can lay down cardboard, you can lay down paper. If you have craft paper in your house that happened to be left over from a construction job, that works really well too. But if you don't have that, usually we can find free cardboard somewhere. So that would be the route I would take. And for this project, working with ink, your biggest enemy is to be pressed for time. You want to be able to slow down and take your time with it. So what you'll notice here is I'm brought out the ink that I was having you get is a Higgins ink, and this is an India ink, right? And I just got ink all over my hands, but right there, right? You might want to have fabric around you or paper towels. So it looks like I didn't wipe that properly. I wonder if this has a crack. So these Higgins ink, normally they come with a dropper. I wonder if I'm going to be able to, yeah, I'm barely going to be able to grab the ink in here. But the dropper is there. It's kind of like an eyedropper. You go in there, you grab your ink, and then you take it to the area you're going to work. Now you could put this directly on your paper, or if you have a little palette, right? You can just put it in the palette. Sumi ink, this is from Daiso. This is a Japanese dollar store. There's one, the nearest one I know of, they kind of moved into a lot of the Pier 1 imports, but the nearest one I know of is in Pleasant Hill. So that's a Daiso. It's a Sumi ink, which is probably more common in Japan, Japan and China. So it's a type of brush painting. And then there's a few tools here, right? So some of you got a brush tool like this, right? That would be a Sumi ink brush, and that's why they call it a Sumi brush, because it's used with Sumi ink. And then I have water near me. So I might have something, and if you don't have a palette like this, you can use any container. So this is a food container. Glass is ideal. Having some of those around, and water. I might have a few different types of water in here. So on mine, I'm going to go ahead and use a combination of this and then probably these guys over here. Before I started with this, taping down all four corners. If you want this to not warp that much, your paper, right? This paper right here, I would probably tape it all the way around. Right now, it'll warp the way that I've taped it, which means if I don't want this to warp as much, I would tape every single edge. Know that wherever the tape is touching, it may damage your paper and it may tear it or rip it. That's okay. That's just what you would do in the art world, is you just reduce your frame. You add more on the matting and you cover up the areas you don't want people to see, right? You can also cut your paper after you've actually finished the drawing. Right, so taped all four edges. And I'm not even going to work with any pencils right now. We're just going to see how the brushes and the materials work. So this may not be like a representational image, but I do want you to see what sort of control you can have with this. So right now with the brush wet, so I've dipped this brush in water right here. I might want to have, let's see if I have one of these rags. I'm going to find a cleaner rag. This rag will work. Right? I might have a rag here that I can blot and get excess water off of. So if I wanted just a little bit of water, right, I can control it. And then let's get some ink in here. And you don't need a lot, right? I'm going to start with a little like that. Now, one of the first things you can do is wet on wet. So if you haven't worked with watercolor, there's where it touched a little bit right there. Right? If I have just what's called wet on wet, because what we're used to working with is dry on wet on dry, which means dry paper, and then you're just kind of drawing straight onto it. That's how we do most of our drawing. With wet on wet, I can kind of shape this brush a little bit, right? If I need more of a point. Now I'm using pure ink here, and as I dip, it kind of spreads out. So it's like there's a whole bunch of capillaries in your paper, and it's going to spread out to wherever it sucks the pigment. But if let's just say I'm not worrying about this being representational yet. What I'm going to be drawing here is a suggestion of a face. I'm drawing the eyes right now. Not too much on the nose, maybe a little bit of the shadow behind the nose, and then this would be the right eye. And then the cheek structure, upper lip. And notice that there's a lack of detail here. Working with wet on wet, you have to acknowledge that you're not going to get a lot of detail. So it's really about working with large strokes and letting it do what it does. And if you have a big brush like this, it's impossible to do all the detail. If you want to get more detail, and as you can see here where it's not wet anymore, it's starting to dry up. My brush is kind of, the ink is drying up, the brush is drying up a bit, and you get what's called a dry brush. And this happens in painting. You can use that as a textural element, the dry brush, like if I wanted to give him some hipster hair here.
Wow. I wish I could draw like that.
Right, and that's like one way to work with it. And I would say, like, for your sample, don't worry about it being representational, it being abstract like this, and just understanding like what happens when I work with the brush as dry brush, right, on your sample sheet. Now, if this is the only brush you have, you are limited on the level of detail. So that's where I would recommend getting another tool. Seeing, do I have anything? I'm trying to be inventive here. Don't have anything that's wood. Hold on, I got an idea. I think I have a cotton swab. And I even have some homemade bamboo brushes or pens. Right, so this is made from bamboo. It has to be green if you do that. So if you end up watching that video and how to make stuff, you can also make it out of just a stick, like by carving a stick. So like this one right here, if I had a twig from the backyard, get this a little bit wet and dip it in the plain ink. If it's, and you have to do a lot of dipping back and forth, you can use it a lot like you would use a pen and ink. And at a certain point, one of the characteristics of pens, see how it gets lighter as I draw because there's less ink on the surface of the edge, right? So I have to constantly go back and forth and dip. And maybe I'm just learning how to draw a circle and I run out of ink, right? That's okay. This is part of the process of working with handmade tools. You're going to run out of ink constantly, and it doesn't give you a clean mechanical look that you would get from, say, a pre-purchased pen from a store. So that's one of the benefits to it, is it has this nice organic feel, right? And you can layer it. So I'm layering. Now, if I didn't have something like this, be inventive. Think about what's around your house. Like, what does a Q-tip look like? And does it matter? What happens if I get it wet after I've already inked it? oh, I can get some tone there, right? Maybe I can use this as a brush. Now, if I take the other end, so that's the cotton side. So cotton is like your t-shirt, right? That lets you know that, oh, if it's a t-shirt, I can also use that. What happens if I take this cotton piece off? And then I just go back and mark it. So it makes a pretty thick line. So that's not as controlled as the thinner line. But if I rotate it, I'm using just the corner now, I can get a thinner line. And then it wears out at a certain point. So I might have to go back here, dip it, and see, yeah, it's still a pretty thick line. But the bonus is you have this and then you write Q-tip, especially if I'm learning how these work. I might forget what I used, especially if I'm just grabbing random things from around. This was the bamboo. This one over here was the wet. This is wet on wet, which means wet paper, and then you draw on top. I have water next to me so I can clean my pen consistently. When this dries, it has a medium in it called, it might have a shellac or a varnish depending on the manufacturer. And varnish is kind of like what you would seal wood in, right? So it may only come off with a solvent. So I can look, you know, that's something we can look up together, but usually for shellac, you use rubbing alcohol and that melts shellac. So if it's a shellac, you can use rubbing alcohol or any denatured alcohol, and that might help clean up your tools. So you can see with this one, you know, with it being used and maybe not cleaned off right away, this pen nib should be more of a brass color and it looks sort of black, right? This is more of like a traditional pen and ink, and I would need more ink than I have here. If you have a pen nib like this, you can also use this to draw. The way you hold it is this way, right? Wherever it's comfortable, you hold it kind of like a pen. And I saw some instructional video of them holding it upside down. I'm not sure why they were holding it this way, but usually you hold it like that. So you see like looking at it this way, rotating it. And you actually let the flow do everything. If you push down too hard on this, it spreads. You see how that turns into two lines? It spreads this, this actually has a split down the middle, and it'll spread it out apart. So it'll go from a single line to like spread out like that. So you don't want to push too hard because you can actually, you know, bend it and alter. So I'm actually just dragging this. Go ahead.
The pen that you're using, what's the name of that?
This is just a pen and ink. Pen and ink. Pen and nib is what they call it.
Oh, okay.
Can you read this? I'm going to write it right now.
Pen. I'm going to write that down.
I don't have enough ink in here. I'm making my life really hard. Actually, I need a lot more. That'll work.
Pen.
And normally I would also have, while I'm working with ink like this, you might want to have scrap paper next to you so you can make a quick mark.
Oh.
Before you go to your drawing. And this is, you might have noticed I mentioned this when you're working with charcoal. Always have some scratch paper around while you're working, because it allows you to get familiar with the tool before you go over to your drawing. And then there's a certain point where you're like, oh, I feel confident. And this is and that little shatter, I don't know if you saw that, that's called chatter. It kind of shook and it splattered around. So let it be what it is. It's okay if that happens. Let it happen. Work with it in your drawing. Make it a part of the drawing. So if you get an accidental splatter and an ink, and then this part, the actual part that is the tool, it looks kind of like this. There's a split down the middle.
Oh, okay.
And then there's a
Okay.
little hole right here. That's the inkwell. I'm
Oh.
looking at it this way right now.
Mm-hmm.
If I wipe this and clean it, these come apart. And that's your nib.
Oh.
Now this, taking it like a level to replace a brush, right? So you can either use brushes. They make these refillable brushes. The quality is not the same as these Sumi ink brushes, but you can actually fill these with India
Oh.
ink, and you can add water to it. So these like unscrew, and then you put ink in the plastic part here. If you squeeze it too hard, though, it'll push too much ink out. But these are kind of nice because you, after this dries, right? That's on that first exercise. Then you can go back and draw something
Mm-hmm.
on it.
Oh, I like those.
All right, so that looks like that. And they come in different sizes. So this one might have been a part of a kit where they had more than one type. So they had like a small. This one is almost like a calligraphy pen. It's meant for like,
Yeah. Ooh.
you know, you can
That
do
one's
like.
thicker. Darker. Wow.
That's kind of meant for like bigger, bolder line.
Mm-hmm.
But they can get damaged over time, so you know it's something you might have to replace.
Man.
Nothing lasts forever. But these ones are only a couple years old. This one looks like I might have added water to it. No, maybe not. That looks pretty dark. Some of them I add water to it, so I get a gray out of it. And that's something else you can do. What's really nice about working with, you know, a palette, like a little palette like this, is I can go back. Let me put this back in before I lose it. Okay. I could grab water, you know, put it in here. You can say like, oh, well, this is light gray, this is dark gray, and this is medium gray or dark gray, right? So you just add a little bit from here. That was only a little touch, and let's see how dark that made it. Pretty dark. Now, let's say that was too dark. I would get my towel, come back here, blot it, and I'm not smearing it, I'm just touching it and lifting. Right? So it's sort of like a blot and lift. And if this is too messy for you, like you can see how my hands got really messed up, wear gloves. So any gloves that are comfortable for you. I mentioned like to pull them up so that way they're not, you know, they're not too loose on the end on your fingertips. This time I'm going to add a little bit less, so I'm going to barely touch a little bit of that at a time. Let's see if this one's lighter. Yeah, this one's lighter. Go to this one. This one should be darker. And then when they touch, they'll bleed into each other. Kind of see what's happening there?
Yeah.
So let's think about this in a few ways. Let's do a big circle. So wet on wet. So I'm going to add that circle. Now I'm going to go with the lighter tone. Maybe I'll do this right around the center. And it's going to stop where the water stops.
Oh.
I think I mentioned on this one that you might want to have a hair dryer. If it's really wet like this, you probably will have to walk away. Like this face right here kind of dried up and this one dried up, but that's going to take a while before it starts to dry.
Oh.
Because I put a lot of water on there. So I'm going to try this one right now. And then here's the darker one. Right? And if I avoid touching it, it won't bleed into this area. And the nice thing is you can keep layering and layering tones. If it's too dark, remember you can blot things. Like, oh, that went too dark. So I can blot that, pick it up. I'm I'm going to go into my lighter one. Like maybe I just want a little bit of tonality on his cheek here because it's in shadow on this side. I can add that light tone. That'll help fill in some of the hair too, so it won't look as stark. And then I would let this dry and I'd come back later. Once it's dry, so this might be something where you have like you're working on it and you walk away and go do something else. I got some yellow on here. I got the wrong. These are water soluble. I should have grabbed a different rag. I forgot. I have gouache on this. Okay. Questions so far? I think the tools that you have are this. I would recommend searching around your house. Maybe you might have Q-tips. Maybe you might have toothpicks. So if you grabbed a toothpick, you could use that and dip it and draw with it, and you'll make these nice little faint lines like that. Q-tips, it's going to be much larger, right? That's the Q-tip. Wet on wet, which is where you're making a large section wet, and then you're adding a little bit of ink at a time to it. And notice, like wherever the gravity took it, that's where it ended up. So since this paper's warped, it went into all the little grooves where the warping happened. So if you want something more controlled, you're going to have to use less water. So the less water, the more control. So let's take this, for example. If I pick this up and I go and draw over here,
Does using a smaller brush give you more control?
yes. Oh yeah, you brought up a good point. I did bring out other brushes here. I'm starting to crowd myself. Let me move some of this stuff out of the way. Normally I don't work with this many things on the table. But I'm kind of just showing you all your options. Okay, so other brushes that you could use. Maybe you might have a finer watercolor or a acrylic brush. This is an acrylic brush. The acrylic brushes are a bit more stiff, and what that means, they won't, like these Sumi inks are closer to watercolor. See how they kind of push and they're really soft? They're really great for these big expressive strokes and washes and this sort of like dry brush technique. These are not as good for dry brush, but I'm going to take this finer one and let's see. Let's pick up the same ink here. Now notice with the finer brush, it also looks darker because it's not spreading that same amount of ink over a large area. And even though this is the same ink up here, the more you layer it, the darker it'll get. So if I let this dry again and then I paint over it again with the same exact ink, it'll slowly get darker until it gets to a certain density, and then it won't get any darker. So with this sort of brush, I can get pretty detailed. Like, I don't know. And then let me try a much darker ink so you can see the clarity of it. Let's go back. This is where I was using a pen nib. It will not be as detailed as the pen nib, but you can get pretty detailed. As I run out and use more of the ink, it will slowly become lighter and lighter. So where I first made a line, it was dark. As I start to run out of ink, it gets light. So then I might have to go back, dip it, go over that same area. So if you're working with pure ink, you can do this cross-hatching that we kind of worked with in earlier when working with line. That cross-hatch technique works really well for this. You can also work with, I talked about line weight. That is how thin and thick something is. So thin, I might be dragging it across. I'm trying to only let this is like line weight. Now I'm going to do the same line. And what I'm going to do is, as I'm drawing it, I'm going to push down. And I'm going to go light again. So to make a line, to change your line weight with ink, you actually add pressure. So as I'm going down and I push harder, it makes a thicker line. As I lift, it'll make a thin line. So you can also play with this using a brush, and I think that's something that's it's what is a characteristic that you can use with a brush that you can't do with the pen nibs. That was the pen and ink dipping one, or you can't do it with like these bamboo pens. These bamboo pens, I'll take this one for example. So these are carved. There's a split down the middle. See if I can get enough ink. Normally you need a lot more ink for these ones. So here's say this is a blindfold. But it gets a really nice line, and it draws a lot more like a pen. Has a nice sound too. If you want a thinner line with these, usually sideways, but it will dent the bamboo a little bit, and then you can get a broader tip depending on how wide you cut this. And if there's heavy ink here, you can still kind of pull that ink from the center part and push it away. So all I'm doing on this is doing mark making with this sheet and kind of experimenting with the tools. I don't really have any vision in mind other than when I first started with this one of recreating a face. If this wet on wet right here is still wet, as I draw over it, notice how it bleeds here where it's wet, and where it's drier, it doesn't bleed as much.
Is there a reason why the bamboo pen holds the ink better than the metal ones, or is it just because?
Oh, there's a lot more surface. So if you look at the difference in the size, where did my pen and ink go? I'm looking. I don't know where I dropped it. Oh, here it is. If you look at the sheer size of it, this has a lot more surface area, and this has very little surface area. Right? There's a lot of places the ink can travel to. So literally, you're literally carrying more ink on the bamboo one. That's all. That's the only reason. And it will, it'll mark and stain your pens. If you run into something, they do make a ink solvent cleaner that you can purchase in the store. I believe if this really is shellac, though, you should be able to use rubbing alcohol. And 70% would be fine that you would get from the store. If you run into that problem, let me know. I can research that and find a better cleaner. But yeah, these come in a lot of different sizes too. I have some examples here. These are calligraphy, right? And they have different sort of tips. So these will hold more ink and they'll make a broader tip. The one that I'm using is a detail pen that's on there. So that's meant for like doing really fine details. That's like this one. When they're cleaner, they look like this. You should see either the brass tip or the metal. The one that I have there, you know, many people have used it, not just me. It's been students, so this one's gotten a bit dirty over time. But I'll see what I can do to get this one clean. When I was talking about rubbing alcohol, I'll show you what I'm talking about. Let's see if that works. Rubbing alcohol. This one is 91%. Hard to find right now because of, like, this was a easy supply to get pre-COVID. So I'm a little more hesitant using it lately. It's funny how it's something I might soak in here for a little bit, right? And just see if it rubs off. I'm gonna grab a fresh material to wipe with. You can still hear me okay, right?
Yes.
Or do I sound distant? Because I don't have the microphone on me.
It's a little distant, but it's okay.
Okay, hold on. Yeah, so I was mentioning that, you know, having a clean cloth. Yeah, I think this is going to need a heavier cleaner than rubbing alcohol. So I might need to use something a little bit stronger. So I'm going to let this soak for a little bit, and I'll check it out later. We'll see if that holds up. Any other questions?
No.
I'm good. This is really
Good.
beneficial.
All right. Does this help for getting a little, like, being a little more like, oh, okay, it's not that bad?
Yes.
Yeah.
Even after seeing me spill it at the very beginning.
Yeah. Well, that helped.
So we're not all perfect, if that helps. I'm just trying a different cleaner just to see if that's any different. No. Okay. It might be more of a varnish based. It's taking off a little bit off of the surface, but I think this needs a heavier cleaner. If it's varnish, I need something heavier like a acetone or a mineral spirit. So I'll look into that. But if you clean it right away after you use it, like if you dip it in your water and then wipe it, these, you know, they'll last quite a while without having to do a rigorous cleaning. The India ink is a little more harsh. So Higgins makes different types of inks. Oh, yeah, like what are your other options? So if you find like, oh my God, I really love working with pen and ink or just working with ink in general, this might be something that some of you might expand into. I mentioned before, they come in hot colors. So inks can come in these sort of vibrant colors. There's like a bright magenta. They even come in like iridescence, and this is probably more for a brush. This one's a bit harder to clean. This is kind of like a pearlescent color. And then here's a really like neon green, right? So one of the cool things is you can find a variety. This is a pearlescent blue. And then this one's kind of more like it's a blue-green, kind of like a phthalo blue or phthalo green. And some of them, if you don't store them right, they will make a mess. This one made a mess in my box. So I'm gonna have to clean this one out. Okay, made a mess all over. This is, oh, that's an interference thread. That's not what I was thinking. There was a material I used to have in here. There's a material that, I don't know if they still make it. Golden made, Golden is a brand, right? They made a material that you could paint on any surface and convert that surface to a watercolor surface. So it's just kind of interesting fact. I don't know if they still make that material. I never got to test it out, but it would allow you to like paint onto, say, metal or onto wood, and then use a watercolor right over it. So it converted the surface and made it more porous, so it would take water. So sometimes there's things like that too. Like if you're really into this and you want to experiment, then there's other mediums you can apply, and that would be like a mixed media project. But yeah, there's a lot of different things you can do with ink. I'm just kind of curious what this neon green looks like. It's got my, some of these settle in time because remember there's a carrier in it and pigment. So you might need to shake it. Make sure the top is on. That's what I was trying to do before, was shake it. And my top wasn't on securely. I'm going to use just a brush with this one since. Oh yeah, that's pretty neon. And my ink is still wet, so it's smearing.
Oh, wow.
So wherever it's gray, right, it's not going to be that saturated in its color.
Mhm.
Let me rotate. Stop overbuilding, bro. Like, holy crap, dude. My God. Yes, you were.
Yeah. Yeah. So there you go. All right, so I'll go ahead and post this so people have access to this video. I'll put this in the same area where you have ink in your exercises, so that way you don't have to dig around and search for it. All right, cool. I think that's about it. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording unless there's anything specific on ink, and then I can answer any questions.
Okay.